Welcome back, I'm Bill. Today I've got something pretty unique for you. In fact, I've got two things that are pretty unique. This is a Unimet camp stove, and this is a camper branded Unimet lantern. The camp stove is extremely uncommon. There are only maybe 3 or 4 that seem to be out there in the collector community. And the lantern, it's not rare, but they're certainly not common. We don't know why some of the Unimet lanterns were branded for this camper brand. We don't know if they were sold through different channels or maybe they were made for a specific retailer. But this is exactly the same as the Unimet model GL3. So this is a Unimet model GL3. This one's slightly different. They had variations within the same model, but most of the GL3s look exactly like this. This has a pinned screw-in bail and it's got a knob on the cleaning lever, but otherwise they're identical. And like I said, most GL3s look like this, not like this. How did this happen? Well, a little bit about the history of Unimet. It's actually the brand name, or it was the brand name, for the lanterns and stoves sold by Union Metal Works. Union Metal Works started in 1936. It was, I guess he was some kind of a military governor of the Guangdong province who fled to Hong Kong and started a bicycle manufacturing company there. It was Union Bicycle Works. Eventually it became Union Metal Works as they started making other things, and after World War II they began focusing on kerosene camp stoves and lanterns. For the most part, the lanterns look like sort of Petromax clones, and the stoves look like the single burner brass European style kerosene stoves. They may have made some gasoline models in there somewhere, but this design actually happened, we think. Again, none of this is documented, but putting together the timeline of the models and who was making what and for whom, it appears that they got this model via Sears from American Gas Machines. Here's how that worked. Sears, for their J.C. Higgins sporting good brand, contacted American Gas Machines in the early 1950s and contracted them to make lanterns and stoves. Later, for example, when Sears would work with Coleman, the Sears branded lanterns and stoves were very similar to Coleman's, but they had their own distinctive features. In those early years in the 1950s, the Sears models were just the AGM models with different livery or different color scheme. So, for example, this is an American Gas Machines Camp Light LRL 21A or B, made in the mid to late 50s. They made a version of this all the way back to the early 50s, but this is the American Gas Machines version. During the 1950s, they were contracted by Sears, and I'm sorry, this one's a little grungy, and the generator is not currently on it, and neither is the globe. And someone's kludged on a knob here because the original knob went missing. And this is all clocked backwards, but I think you'll get the idea. I haven't had a chance to work on this yet, but this is exactly the same lantern made for Sears. A different color scheme, but otherwise exactly the same. We don't know why Sears went to Unimet. It may have been something where one year they were made by AGM and another year they were made by Unimet, but this one has been fully restored. Unimet made the same lanterns for Sears, for their J.C. Higgins line, and if you were to take these two apart and compare everything, they are exactly the same. The only difference you'll find on them is that this one on the collar says made in the United States of America, and this one says made in Hong Kong. The model numbers are the same in everything. So we think that this is how Union Metal Works got the AGM designs, because they were making these for Sears, and they made them up until roughly about 1960, possibly 1961. And that was the point at which AGM ceased operations. During the 1940s and 1950s, all of these lantern and stove manufacturing companies were they merged and some were bought out, and AGM ended up part of a company called Queen Stove, and then Queen Stove got bought out by King Sealy, and King Sealy also bought Thermos, and We're not sure why. I suspect it's because Thermos's lantern and stove designs were more modern looking than this. AGM never really updated their designs from the late 1930s. So about 1960 or 61, King Sealy phased out the AGM designs and continued making lanterns under Thermos's name with Thermos's designs. They kept a few of the AGM models around, like the inverted lantern, but they were all produced under the Thermos name, and AGM went away, and those designs disappeared with them. So I kind of suspect what happened was that Union Metal Works then, no longer making stuff for Sears, had these AGM designs. AGM was effectively defunct, and so Union Metal Works said, hey, let's just use that design for ourselves. And they started making lanterns based on that design. And that lantern was the GL3. Now there are other variations of it, but they're all based on that AGM design, and this is the same as well. Union Metal Works continued making these Unimet lanterns and stoves up until 1967, when they were purchased by the Ash Flash Corporation, which was based in the United States. And then they started making products under the Ash Flash name. And they were sold, well, at least around North America. So that was the end of Unimet in terms of lanterns and stoves. Just by way of interest, Unimet is still around. After they got rid of the gas appliances division, they got into real estate development, warehouses and things like that in Hong Kong. And actually, if you go over, I'm on Vancouver Island, but if you take a ferry over to the mainland and go to Vancouver and go downtown on Burrard Street, there's a Unimet office. And Unimet is a major player in property or real estate development over in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. So they're still around, they're just doing something completely different. So we'll get this out of here. The plan with both of these is to do a minimal restoration. I just want to clean them up and get them looking as nice as I can. I'm not going to repaint because this is extremely rare. This guy's relatively rare too. So I'm just going to do a cleanup, polish, all of that kind of thing. I especially like, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but it's even got the original camper globe, which is unusual for these. So we'll clean up the lantern. The stove, it's in pretty good shape. It's missing one of the latches. I don't know if I'll be able to replace it. I haven't been able to find a replacement locally. I've ordered one online that's on its way here that I might be able to take apart and use some parts from. But that might be a lost cause for now. The stoves, and someone has repainted the inside of this with silver spray paint. I suspect it's barbecue paint, which means it's probably not going to come off easily. I don't want to strip the whole thing. At the very least, I want to clean the overspray off of the lid and off of the tank. And just do a general cleanup and polish and get all of the working parts cleaned up. I've been using this stove off and on since last summer, and it works great. So normally I take a big 3-burner Canadian Coleman 444 camping, but for a short trip, if I'm not taking an oven or something like that, this guy is great. So I'm going to do a minimal cleanup on it. I'll see if I can get the silver paint out of the inside. If not, I may sand it and do a better silver paint job in it because this metallic blue is extremely hard to duplicate. So we'll see what happens. As far as the design of this, a lot of it screams American gas machines. It's got the AGM style generator. It's got an AGM style knob. The burners and the manifold are in the style of American gas machines. That said, I'm not aware of any AGM stove in this design or this style where the tank mounts on the end. There is a J.C. Higgins stove that appears to have only been sold in Canada that is virtually identical to this. It has spring clips on the end instead of latches, and it's got a similar tank that mounts on the front with the generator on this burner. And I strongly suspect it was made by Unimet for J.C. Higgins. Other features of this, like the handle and parts of the tank, look like Unimet copied the design that Thermos had, which elements of that had come from American gas machines. So as far as the design history of the stove, that's a little more obscure and mixed. But anyhow, the stove will be featured in part 2 of this series. We'll get to work on the lantern for part 1 here. Let's start with the bail. And we'll take our vent nut off. You can see they even, it's a little bit different, but they even kind of duplicated the AGM style vent nut on this. A globe and vent. Now, everything on top is held on with this screw here. Sometimes I use an adjustable wrench because it's convenient, other times because it's a necessity, and with Unimet it seems to be a necessity. As much as they copied AGM, I've never had luck putting a wrench on anything on a Unimet. I don't know what the deal is. Metric SAE, if it does fit, it barely fits and you have to work to put it on and it scratches everything up, and usually things just don't fit. Again, metric SAE, so I don't know what the deal is with that, if it's poor manufacturing tolerances or what, which doesn't make sense because the build quality on these is just fine and they're great runners. So that screws down into the top of the valve assembly and it holds the whole burner assembly on. And so we just take that off and we'll set this aside. So this is our air tube and this is the mixing chamber. So the air for combustion gets sucked in through the collar, up through this tube, and mixes with the gasoline vapor in this little chamber here. This is crimped together. This is, this sits on here like this. And, oh, I've got it through the wrong hole. So this sits like under here like this, and it sits on top of the generator. So the generator feeds into this mixing chamber from the other side, and then our combined air and fuel mixture shoots up through this hole and through this tube and into the manifold. And when you're taking apart these AGM style lanterns, always take note of how things are adjusted, at least roughly. It'll make it easier to put it back together. I've got a video record here, which is particularly handy. You might want to take photos. You can put everything back, screw everything back on to about where it started. That'll make things easier. The burner cap is cast as part of this manifold, and you'll notice there's no screen. I'll see, this probably isn't going to come off. Oh, it did come off. Usually I say just leave the vent studs on. I don't think this guy's seen that much use, so things aren't in horrible shape. But if your vent stud doesn't want to come out, just leave it, because it may shear off if you try to force it. These uprights are held on with little tiny screws on the bottom, or with rather little tiny nuts. Kind of hard to see because these are all sooty. These are brass, or at least they are on the AGMs and on at least one other Unimet I've worked on. These actually look a little bit like steel, but whatever the case, they are small enough that when you put this back together, if you over tighten these, you can easily split them. Ask me how I know. And notice how our base plate has this lip is on, this ledge is on the top facing upward. We'll want to take note of that later, as well as the orientation of the holes in the bottom. Now you'll be able to figure this out when you put it back together, but here's our, the generator comes up through here, our air tube comes up here, and they feed into here. So this big hole is going to line up with this side of the manifold. So there's base plate. These screws, or I keep calling them screws, these nuts, again, take note of where they sit. I notice on this they're actually uneven, which is interesting. If you take note of where they sit, it'll be easier to put this back together, because if you just screw them all the way on until they bottom out down here, the manifold's going to end up sitting way too low. Again, this is another thing. I'm going to guess on this, I bet they come out easily. But if you've got a really crusty lantern that's heavily rusted, and note the short threads go on top and the long on the bottom, these uprights can be rusted in place, and I suspect they can break fairly easily, especially if they're rusty. So that's our manifold, all one cast piece. Now, we should be able to take the collar off. No, we need to take the generator off first. I'm pretty sure that if something's wrong with your generator, or if the needle is missing, I'm pretty sure that these Unimets will also use an AGM. We can tap on this a bit. There we go. Get that nut off. The rest of this, the gas tip on most of these is either cast or soldered in place, so you're not going to get it out. And these have an asbestos packing in them. This is actually right down, sticking out the bottom. Chances are that's not going to come out. You could heat and quench and probably get it out, but it's going to be hard to put back in, and it's going to be misshapen. I believe the point for these generators with that big wad of packing in there is these were marketed, you see, as burns leaded and white gas. And these generators were designed to handle the lead contaminant by basically absorbing it. So I happen to know this lantern runs really well, so I might be tempted to do nothing more with this, just clean up the outside. If you do get it wet, you'll want to make sure that it gets dried inside before you try to put it back together, because this thing's going to be a bear to start if this packing's saturated. But I recommend not trying to take that out, because you probably won't get it back in. And if you do get it back in, there's a narrow hole down the middle. I'll show you, take our cleaning rod out. There's a narrow hole down the middle for this cleaning needle. And if it gets messed up, you're going to probably end up breaking a needle. So discretion may be the better part of valor with trying to clean these up. If it works, leave it alone, or do a minimal cleanup. The collar just tilts and goes around that actuator. And we'll take our, well, actually, before I take the fuel knob off, let's take the valve stem out. That's unscrewed, so we can take our jam nut off, and there we go. That's our valve stem. This black thing here, that's our graphite packing. The direction disc, and some of these, this knob will come off. On this, it's hard to tell because it's really dirty back there. It does have a brass, fitting on it, but not all of them will come off easily. So I will probably leave this the way it is. When I clean all this stuff up in citric acid, I want to put everything in because it cleans, it helps loosen all the grease and the grime that's on here. But I don't want the graphite contaminated with the citric acid. So the easiest way to do that is to temporarily put it back in the valve, tighten everything down so that the graphite packing is protected from the citric acid. Leave it in there just long enough to break up the grease, 5-10 minutes. Don't boil it, and then go ahead and take it out. Remove this from the valve body, and you can continue to boil away the valve body. The graphite packing in the cleaning lever usually isn't a problem in the citric acid. Sometimes the cleaning lever assembly is easy to get off, and sometimes it's not. So we'll see here. And it's not going to be easy to get off. So leave this alone. There's nothing that you can't get clean in there with a good citric acid or white vinegar bath. So we'll leave this the way it is for now, and we will just remove the valve from the fount. So I have found the easiest way to get these out is just to take a big adjustable wrench and put it on there. And they're usually not that tight. And it will just spin off. All right, so here's our fuel and air tube. These are pretty much just like a Coleman at this point. Although some of these have a very, very thin wire at the end. This does not. Some of these will have a very thin wire. So we've got our spring on here, fuel and air tube, and if you wanted to take this apart further, my suggestion would be to hit this with a propane torch if you're really insistent on getting that off. Don't unscrew the outer nut. That's just for the graphite packing that keeps this sealed. But if you really want to take all of this apart and get the eccentric block out, hit this with a propane torch and it should separate nice and easily. So that's that. Let's take our pump apart. This is held in with a couple of screws. Don't lose them. They are difficult to replace. The easiest way to get these out is just to pop it out that way. This has got some real goop on it. So there's a nut that holds everything together. And there's our leather pump cup. Set that aside. These are nice because they have a brass kind of a spring inside that makes sure that they're splayed out so they fit in the tube nice and solidly. There's a little brass ring here that helps keep the pump cup centered, and then we've got a little backing plate that's got lots of goop stuck on it. And then our spring and our outer cap and the pump. You might notice this doesn't have the little hole in the middle. There were variations on this with AGM. Toward the end, they got rid of the hole in the middle, whereas with a Coleman or the early AGMs, you have to put your thumb over the hole in order to pump it up. These, you don't have to bother with that. You just pump it up, and it just works easier that way. And the fuel cap. This does sort of seal, but not very well, so I'm going to replace the cap gasket in here, and you can dig these out with a small pick or a small screwdriver and end up stabbing your fingers. The easiest way to do it is simply to burn it out with a propane torch. But the last thing with this fount is the check valve. Now I know this check valve works. This thing holds pressure well, so I'm not too worried about it. It would be nice to get that cleaned out, but this won't work with my Coleman check valve tool. Even though it's designed the same way, the slot is a different size, the thread pitch in the middle of it's a different size. So the only way I'm going to get this out is using a really big screwdriver, and I really don't want to chance it. These are notoriously tight, and I don't want to end up destroying the check valve, because if you slip out of that slot, you can damage it, and I don't want to do that. So since I know the check valve is working, I'm just going to leave it alone. So that's the end of our disassembly. This stuff will get a basic cleanup with soap and water, although on the fount, I'm going to be very careful, because my previous experience with Unimet lanterns and their decals is that they turn to mush almost instantly if they get wet. So I'm going to be cautious with this fount, keep it as dry as I can, and clean that up. And then the rest of these parts, minus the collar, the rest of these parts will all go into a citric acid bath, and we'll get simmered away in that to remove rust and crud. Here we are with our citric acid boil. I've got steel and nickel parts over here on the right. I've got my bale over here. Because it's so long, it doesn't fit in a pot, so I've got it in some plastic over here, also in citric acid. And way over here, I've got all of our brass parts, and they're simmering away. In a few minutes, I will take that the valve stem out so that the graphite packing doesn't get messed up. But I will, for the most part, leave these things here for about 30 minutes. Usually does the trick. That manifold for the top of the lantern will probably stay in a bit longer, and I may actually increase the citric acid concentration. Normally I do about 1 teaspoon of powder per liter of water, and I might double that for that guy just because it's so rusty. Everything else I think will be fine in fairly short order. All right, let's clean up these parts that will just take some soap or degreaser and water. Just using some simple green. All right, now our fount, and again I want to protect the decal, both of these, as much as I can while still getting things clean. I want to get a round brush down in here to remove some of that goop. And I'm going to leave it at that. I will pat these decals dry, and the rest of the cleanup we'll do with some polishing compound. One interesting thing when I got this cleaned up, I noticed it's dated 1965. That's the first time I've ever seen a date stamped on a Unimet product, but there you go, right in that window when I said they were making these. So I'm going to use some Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. I know it's for metal, but it works way better on paint. than any automotive paint polish that I have tried. It's much finer, does a much better job, and it doesn't remove a bunch of paint. You can see it just kind of the oxidized surface will come off on the rag, but this stuff is so fine it won't touch the paint at a deeper level. Alright, that's quite a bit better. It's not the greatest paint, but it's original and it's not bad, all things considered. So, yeah. One last step, I'm going to use some automotive paste wax just to give this an extra bit of shine and to help protect it. Right, we waxed on, time to wax off. All right, I think that looks pretty great. We've preserved the patina, but we've made it really shine. And that's what I'm going for with this lantern and stove combo. It's used, but it's original, but it looks nice. Here are almost all of our parts that have come out of the citric acid bath. So I just need to rinse everything off, and I'm going to rub them down with some 4/0 steel wool to get all of the crud and grime and tarnish, whatever is on these, off. And then we'll polish them on a buffing wheel. All right, now it's time to start rebuilding this thing. So we'll start with the fount. Got our cap. Got a new gasket here. Just put that thing on there. our pump, goes in here. The cap, spring, backstop, that little cylinder that keeps the leather centered. Got our cleaned up leather. Our little spring. And the nut. Oil this with some 3-in-1 oil. Just about any kind of oil is fine as long as it's not vegetable based. And we get our holes lined up in the side. That, and our little retaining screws. In there. We're good. All right, let's set that aside for a little bit. And we'll put our valve assembly back together. So we've got our fuel and air tube, air wire, spring, and I did take the eccentric assembly off, or the tip cleaner assembly. So we'll put that back on first. So our eccentric block, this little claw holds the cleaning needle, so that goes at the top, and it's going to face this opening. So, and this is actually a square opening in here, so it only goes in one way, or well, you can put it in any of 4 different ways, but you don't have to worry about it going the wrong way, I guess. So. What I want to do is try to get it to are a little bit tricky. What you want to do is get it to line up with that notch. Basically, you want this guy to grab it just at the right spot, and it's not cooperating right now. So let's push it back up a little bit. do is just keep pushing it in a little bit further at a time until it grabs it. There we go. I guess the other thing you could do is rotate this until it grabs the notch that this guy rides in. So you can see it going up and down now. So we'll just tighten that. And tighten this guy. Okay. Now we put the spring on the air wire. These are a much sturdier spring than Coleman's, so I'm not too worried about it losing its spring. Putting it the other way, there we go. Drop it in, and it goes on the bottom. And make sure it's snug. Now we're ready to put this in the fount. So I'm going to use some thread sealant. This is not the permanent kind, this is Permatex Blue. It will make sure the threads seal. It should. This is brass, it's a tapered hole. It should seal, but just in case it doesn't, this will make sure it doesn't leak. We'll get this line up so that a little bit more. That's perfect. We'll put our valve stem in. Now we'll thread there we go. Now this nut, you kind of have to tighten it by feel, and depending on the condition of the packing in there, the graphite, it might be tight, it might be loose. That's pretty tight, so I'll back it off a bit. I think that'll be all right. Sometimes once it's heated up and it's gone through a heating and cooling cycle, it'll loosen back up a little bit. What you want to do to make sure it's not too loose is the first time you light it, check underneath here for any fuel leaks. If it's leaking, you'll need to tighten it more. And if it's just not turnable when it is tight and not leaking, then you'll need to replace that graphite packing. I don't know that these are available anymore, but you can use graphite rope to replace what's in there. Now, our generator, oops, careful with the needle, more careful than I just was. I just gave it a little bit of a bump. There we go. Now, I'm going to use the butt end of this first just to make sure that I can get this all the way through, because if I try to force through with the needle, I'll end up bending the needle. So, got our nut. Turn this up as high as it'll go, and carefully feed that needle through. There we go. Make sure that this is nice and snug. Okay. Now for the collar. So this is the hole, this larger hole is what this goes through. So all we have to do is just kind of rotate it around until everything lines up. And this will seat kind of in the middle of this the raised section. And now let's put our burner assembly back together. All right, so we've got this hole and this hole for these guys. Let's make sure these are even. Oh, that's interesting. That would explain why they weren't even before. The threads on these are different lengths. That's very interesting. Okay. These don't appear to be any different, so I don't think that would be it. Those are even. It's hard to tell now. And you remember I said the this hole needs to, or sorry, this hole needs to line up with, this opening in the manifold needs to line up with this hole for the generator. Remember, don't over tighten these or you'll split them. All right. And we'll put this adjusting ring on here. And we'll wait. Tighten that up, that should be fairly close. We can adjust that later. So this will go in here like that, and then the generator plugs in down here. So. Okay. Make sure everything, all of this is seated. So now we just need to adjust this guy. Check that again once we've got the center screw in. That will lock it down. Okay. Well, I think we got it on the first try. Everything looks straight. Just look around, make sure this is seated all the way around. So that's always nice with these when you get it on the first try, because usually that doesn't happen. But that's why you pay attention to where everything was situated. Now, let's put our direction disc back on. Get it oriented properly. Off center. This actually kind of has a large hole in the middle so it can float around. Okay. And our vent stud. Take this off to put a manifold on, but and there we go. I think that looks great, much better. It's still got the patina, but it almost looks new. So let me go off camera here and fill it with gas, tie on a mantle, and we'll be ready to fire it up for a first time. And while we wait, we'll put things back together. Off, we're sealed. Right. Now, since the fuel system has been bone dry, I'm going to crack the valve knob open. This is an 1/8 of a turn. The key is it's just like a Coleman instant light valve. You want to open it, but not so far that you back the valve stem out and release the air wire. So I want to crack it open and listen. I'll hear the whoosh of air. And then what I'm listening for is a sputter of fuel droplets getting out of the generator, and that's when I know it's ready to light and the fuel is being delivered where it should. There we go. It may flare just a bit here. Or not. These do take a little bit longer than, say, like a 220 or something to settle down because that generator is large and it takes a while for it to get hot. And it's going to get all sooty on me. There we go. I should have opened that, or you run that cleaning cycle a little earlier. And then we open it as far as it'll go. That little tick, that was the sound of the air wire being released and popping up. All right, about 5 minutes later to give that mantle some time to burn in, I've turned the lights out and it's burning nice and strong. These are around 350 candle power. I think they're a bit brighter than, say, a 242 or a 200 or 335. Really nice lanterns. They run well. And I really like how this turned out. We kept the patina but really made it look nice. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll dig into that companion Unimet stove. I'll see you next time.